The year was 1944, and the Pacific was burning. Japan's empire, once stretching across Asia, was crumbling under the relentless advance of Allied forces. The Philippines had become one of the fiercest battlegrounds of World War II, a final stand between fading Japanese resistance and the unstoppable tide of American power. Amid this chaos, a 22-year-old Japanese intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda stood at the edge of a small airfield in Lubang Island, clutching his orders, his rifle, and his unshakable faith in the Imperial command. Onoda wasn't an ordinary soldier. He had been trained in Futamata Intelligence School, a secretive military academy that taught survival, guerrilla warfare, and psychological resistance. His mission was not to win battles with bullets but with patience, to outlast the enemy, disrupt their operations, and never, under any circumstances, surrender or die by his own hand. The words of his instructor echoed in his head. Even if Japan surrenders, you will not. You will fight until the Imperial Army returns. As his transport ship approached Lubang Island, the horizon glowed orange from distant gunfire. He could hear the rumble of American planes overhead, bombing positions that had already fallen. Onoda's heart pounded, but there was no fear in him, only determination. To him, this war wasn't just about duty, it was about honor, loyalty, and obedience to the Emperor. These were sacred virtues, and he was ready to uphold them, even if it meant dying alone in a foreign jungle. When Onoda landed, the situation on the island was desperate. Japanese forces were scattered and uncoordinated. The Allied advance had cut off communication with headquarters, and local commanders had no idea what was happening beyond their small perimeters. Supplies were low, morale was lower, and the enemy was closing in. Yet, in the middle of that confusion, Onoda arrived with clear orders. Destroy the airstrip, sabotage the enemy whenever possible, and under no condition was he to surrender. He gathered a small group of soldiers, Corporal Shimada, Private Kozuka, and Private Yuichi Akatsu, and disappeared into the dense Philippine jungle. They carried rifles, ammunition, a few rice rations, and their unwavering belief in the imperial cause. As the last Japanese outpost on Lubang fell, Onoda and his men melted into the green wilderness, beginning a mission that none of them could have imagined would last nearly 3 decades. The jungle became their world. Days blurred into nights as they set up hidden camps, camouflaged beneath towering banana trees and thick vines. They hunted wild animals, gathered coconuts, and collected rainwater in bamboo cups. The humid air was heavy with the constant buzz of insects, and every step felt like walking through a living labyrinth. The war outside had ended, but for Onoda, it was just beginning. Months passed. The sound of gunfire faded. The skies cleared of bombers. And yet, Onoda refused to believe that the fighting was over. One day, leaflets began to fall from the sky, printed messages written in Japanese, announcing that the war had ended on August 15, 1945. They declared that Japan had surrendered, that soldiers were to lay down their arms and return home. To Onoda, these leaflets were nothing more than enemy propaganda. He examined them closely under the dim light of a handmade torch. The paper looked too new, too perfect. "The Americans are clever," he said to his men. "They think they can trick us into surrendering. But we are not fools. The Empire would never surrender." His voice was calm but absolute. The conviction of a man whose reality could not be shaken by ink on paper. The years began to slip by. The jungle swallowed them whole. The 4 soldiers became ghosts, haunting the forests and hills of Lubang. They watched from the shadows as Filipino farmers returned to their fields. They saw new flags raised in villages. But in their minds, this was all a deception. A carefully crafted illusion by the Americans and their collaborators. They would ambush patrols, steal food from local farms, and retreat deeper into the mountains when pursued. Sometimes they clashed with villagers who thought they were bandits. At other times, they fired warning shots at anyone who dared to approach their hidden camps. The locals whispered legends of Japanese spirits still fighting in the jungle. By 1949, 5 years after the war had ended, Onoda's small group had already lost one man. Private Akatsu, tormented by doubt and exhaustion, slipped away from the group one night and surrendered to local authorities. When Onoda heard of it, he was furious. "He has betrayed us," he said coldly. "The Americans must have brainwashed him." In Onoda's mind, Akatsu was no longer a comrade. He was a defector who had fallen victim to the enemy's tricks. The remaining 3 soldiers, Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka, grew closer, bound by shared hardship and unshakable belief. They patrolled the jungle with discipline, repaired their uniforms, cleaned their weapons, and waited for the day Japan would return. Every sunrise was another day of duty. Every sunset was another test of faith. By the early 1950s, however, reality began to creep in. New leaflets appeared, more detailed, with personal letters from family members. "Come home," they read. "Japan has surrendered. The emperor now works for peace." But Onoda's training had prepared him for this too. He told his men that the letters were forgeries, that their families would never write such things. "We are soldiers," he reminded them. "Our mission is clear. Until we receive direct orders from our superior officer, we do not surrender." And so the years rolled on. The jungle became their fortress, but also their prison. Tropical storms would rip through their camps, destroying what little shelter they had. Snakes and leeches tormented them. Hunger became a constant companion. Still, Onoda pressed on, his mind anchored in a world that no longer existed. In 1954, tragedy struck again. During a firefight with a local search party, Corporal Shimada was hit by a bullet. Onoda tried to save him, but the wound was deep. Shimada died in Onoda's arms, another casualty in a war long finished. Onoda buried him beneath a tree, his heart hardened, yet untouched by doubt. "He died a soldier," he whispered. "The war goes on." By now, only Onoda and Kozuka remained, 2 ghosts in a jungle that had moved on from the war they still fought. As the world entered the space age, as nations rebuilt and new generations were born, these 2 men still polished their rifles, still hid from enemy patrols, still believed the Emperor would one day call them home. But that call would not come for another 20 years. The year was 1955, and the world was moving forward. Japan, once reduced to ashes, was now rebuilding. Neon lights replacing the glow of burning cities, children learning peace instead of war. But deep in the thick jungles of Lubang Island, 2 men were still at war. To Hiroo Onoda and his last remaining comrade, Private Kozuka, time had stopped in 1945. They were soldiers of a vanished empire, fighting in a war that no longer existed. Their days began before dawn. They would wake to the cries of unseen birds and the rustle of leaves swaying in the humid wind. Onoda would check his rifle, its barrel cleaned to perfection. Kozuka would prepare a small breakfast, boiled roots, coconuts, and sometimes the meat of wild animals they hunted during the night. Every motion was deliberate, ritualistic, and rooted in the discipline of a soldier who had not lost his purpose. They still held daily briefings. Onoda would unroll a crumpled map, faded, torn, and outdated, and they would study the terrain as though planning their next offensive. "We must be ready when reinforcements arrive," he would say. "Our duty is to delay the enemy's control of this island." Kozuka nodded, never questioning, though his eyes sometimes reflected quiet exhaustion. It had been more than a decade since they'd seen another Japanese soldier. But to them, duty was eternal. They had built a new camp deep within the jungle, camouflaged so perfectly that even hunters could walk by without noticing. They had fashioned waterproof containers for their ammunition, stored dry food in hollowed logs, and set traps around their perimeter. Nights were the hardest. The jungle never truly slept. The sounds of crickets mixed with faraway shouts, and the occasional crack of a branch. To Onoda, every sound was an enemy patrol. Every flicker of light in the distance, a search party coming for them. And search parties did come. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, both the Japanese government and Philippine authorities sent missions to find the remaining stragglers. Leaflets were dropped from the sky once again, not just printed orders but personal letters from families, pleading for their sons to come home. Onoda found one such leaflet near a stream. It contained names, addresses, and even photographs. He stared at it for a long time. Then he looked up at Kozuka and said, "They are trying harder now. That means they know we're winning." To Onoda, logic itself had become a weapon of survival. He twisted every sign of peace into proof that the war still raged on. If new airplanes flew overhead, they were American spies. If the island grew quieter, it was the calm before an invasion. When he saw Filipino farmers harvesting rice, he convinced himself they were working under enemy occupation. His reality was a fortress built on belief, and every year that passed only reinforced its walls. In 1956, a Japanese search team discovered items believed to belong to Onoda, a uniform patch, a knife, a few coins. Newspapers in Tokyo ran the headline, "Japanese soldiers may still be fighting in Philippines." The nation was shocked, but many dismissed it as rumor. Japan was entering an age of prosperity. Few wanted to remember the ghosts of the past. Yet, for those who knew of Onoda's training, it wasn't unthinkable. He had been instructed to resist until given direct orders from a superior officer. Without that, surrender was treason. As years turned into decades, Onoda and Kozuka lived a life that blurred the line between soldier and phantom. They kept journals written on scraps of paper. They recorded the number of patrols spotted, the weather conditions, and supplies left. The entries were cold and methodical, a reflection of men who had buried their emotions beneath layers of duty. Still, traces of humanity lingered. During heavy rains, Onoda would sometimes stare at the sky for hours, whispering prayers to the emperor. Kozuka, more gentle at heart, would hum old Japanese songs, melodies from a home he could barely remember. Once, they found an abandoned newspaper in a farmer's hut. It was dated 1959. The headlines spoke of rockets, television, and peace treaties. Kozuka was stunned. "So much has changed," he murmured. "Can it really all be lies?" Onoda took the paper, glanced at it, and threw it into the fire. "Don't let them fool you," he said sharply. "The Americans print these things to break our spirit." Their minds began to fracture under the weight of isolation. The jungle had its own rhythm, months of silence broken by sudden bursts of fear. Sometimes they went weeks without speaking. Other times paranoia consumed them. Once a local hunter left food near their camp as a peace offering. Onoda, convinced it was poisoned, threw it into the river. Trust was a luxury they could no longer afford. By the 1960s, almost 20 years had passed. Japan was now hosting the Tokyo Olympics, showing the world its rebirth as a peaceful nation. But on Lubang Island, Onoda and Kozuka still patrolled the hills, repairing their weapons and hiding from imaginary enemies. Occasionally, they would attack farmers or burn harvested fields, believing they were disrupting enemy supply lines. These skirmishes frightened locals, who called them the jungle ghosts. Rumors spread across the island, stories of immortal soldiers cursed to fight forever. Despite everything, their bond deepened. They celebrated New Year's Day each year with small ceremonies, bowing toward the rising sun and making silent wishes for Japan's victory. They crafted makeshift flags from old cloth, keeping them hidden under rocks as sacred relics. Each morning, Onoda would inspect Kozuka's gear, ensuring discipline never faded. They might have been forgotten by the world, but they refused to forget who they were. In 1965, another discovery made headlines in Japan. A photograph of two armed men taken by a local. The image was grainy, but clear enough to identify them as Japanese soldiers. Once again, teams were sent to find them. Helicopters flew low over the jungle, shouting messages through loudspeakers. "Onoda! Kozuka! The war is over! Japan needs you home!" But from below, Onoda and Kozuka stayed hidden beneath thick leaves, their hearts steady but minds racing. To them, these helicopters were proof the enemy still feared them. If the war was over, Onoda reasoned, they wouldn't be looking for us. The missions intensified, food drops, letters, even a former officer's voice recordings. All failed. The men remained ghosts, their resolve unshaken. In 1969, a journalist from Japan tried to find them. He trekked for days through dangerous terrain, guided by villagers who had seen glimpses of the phantoms. But when he shouted their names into the trees, only the echo of his voice returned. By now, Kozuka had grown weary. "Lieutenant," he said one night as they sat beside their small fire, "what if they're right? What if Japan really did surrender?" Onoda looked at him with the same cold certainty he had carried since the day he entered the jungle. "A soldier does not question orders," he replied. "Even if the whole world changes, we remain loyal." Kozuka nodded but said nothing more. His heart, though, had begun to crack. The following year, 1970, would mark 25 years since the end of World War II, though Onoda didn't know it. For him, dates meant nothing. Only the mission mattered. Yet something within him, something faint and buried, began to stir. When he gazed at the stars through the canopy of trees, he sometimes wondered if anyone out there still remembered him. And soon, fate would send him a sign, one that would shatter the fragile balance he had built over decades of survival. A sign that would mark the beginning of the end for the soldier who never surrendered. The year was 1950. 5 years had passed since Japan's surrender. Cities had been rebuilt, schools reopened, and the world was trying to move on from the horror of war. But deep inside the dense forests of Lubang Island, Hiroo Onoda still believed the war was far from over. His uniform, once crisp and proud, was now tattered and faded. His rifle, polished and oiled every night, remained his most sacred possession, his link to duty, to the emperor, and to the belief that Japan would one day rise again. Every day, Onoda patrolled the island with a sense of purpose. He would move silently through the trees, avoiding the open beaches where enemy patrols, in truth local villagers, might be seen. When he saw farmers working in the fields, he thought they were enemy agents pretending to be civilians. When he saw planes flying overhead, he assumed they were part of the ongoing Allied surveillance. The war lived on inside his mind, looping endlessly, fueled by duty and isolation. In his early days on the island, Onoda wasn't completely alone. 3 other Japanese soldiers, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, were with him. They had all received similar orders: hold your ground, survive in the jungle, and await new commands. Together, they built makeshift shelters from palm leaves and bamboo, hunted wild animals, and stole rice from local villagers when supplies ran low. At night they would sit around a small fire, whispering about home, about Tokyo, about families they hadn't seen in years. They wondered when the next Japanese battalion would arrive, when they would be relieved of their post. But as months turned into years, and the rescue never came, cracks began to form in their fragile brotherhood. In 1949, the first leaflets began to appear, dropped from planes. They read, "The war ended on August 15, 1945. Japan has surrendered. Come out and return home safely." The men stared at the leaflets suspiciously, studying the text, the font, the printing. Onoda, trained in psychological warfare, immediately dismissed them as American propaganda. "Don't be fooled," he said sternly. "This is the enemy's trick. They want us to surrender." The others followed his lead. After all, Onoda was their commanding officer. But doubt lingered in their hearts. Could it really be over? Could the emperor have surrendered? For men raised in the code of Bushido, the idea of surrender was unthinkable, even dishonorable. Years passed. In 1950, Yuichi Akatsu, the youngest of the group, could no longer bear it. Exhausted, malnourished, and mentally broken, he decided to sneak away. One morning, when the others were patrolling the northern ridge, Akatsu quietly slipped into the forest and vanished. For 6 months he hid, terrified of Onoda finding him. When he finally emerged, he surrendered to local authorities. When Onoda heard about Akatsu's surrender through distant rumors, he was furious. "He's been captured," Onoda said bitterly. They must have tortured him for information. He's no longer one of us. In his mind, the war was still ongoing, and any man who gave up was a traitor. In the years that followed, Onoda and the remaining two men, Kozuka and Shimada, continued their impossible mission. They repaired their rifles using scavenged metal, made new uniforms from old cloth, and lived off coconuts, bananas, and whatever they could steal from local farms. Occasionally, they would raid a village, taking rice or livestock. The locals, terrified of these ghost-like soldiers, called them Japanese spirits. The Philippine government organized several search parties, hoping to find and rescue them. They even brought family members of missing soldiers to the island, calling out their names through loudspeakers. But when Onoda heard these voices, he assumed they were recordings made by the enemy to trick them. By 1952, the other soldiers began to break mentally. They had seen villages celebrating holidays, children laughing, and boats arriving with new supplies, things that didn't make sense in a war zone. Shimada began to doubt Onoda's leadership. Maybe the war really did end, he whispered one night. Onoda refused to listen. You must not waver. Until we receive direct orders from a superior officer, our duty is to fight. But in 1954, tragedy struck. While patrolling near a river, Shimada was shot and killed during a skirmish with local search teams. Onoda buried him with his own hands, placing a small wooden cross over the mound. His heart ached, but his conviction only hardened. He died a soldier, he murmured. Now only two remained, Onoda and Kozuka. They became shadows of their former selves, haunting the jungle like phantoms. They continued their raids, sabotaging what they believed were enemy positions. Between 1954 and 1972, the two men carried out nearly 100 guerrilla operations, burning crops, stealing food, and engaging in gunfights with local police. Dozens of villagers died in these encounters. Every time news of the mysterious Japanese holdouts spread, the Japanese government sent search teams. They dropped new leaflets, newspapers, even photographs of Onoda's own family. Yet every time he dismissed them as fakes. If Japan truly lost, he said, why would the emperor not command me himself to surrender? Then, one day, a helicopter hovered low over the jungle and dropped a small bundle. Inside was a letter from Onoda's brother, written in Japanese. It pleaded, "Hiroo, the war is over, come home." But even then, Onoda's heart refused to believe. The Americans can fake anything, he muttered. Until a superior officer stands before me, I will not surrender. And so, the legend of the man who refused to surrender continued, year after year, decade after decade. Villagers would sometimes hear gunshots echo through the jungle. Crops would go missing overnight. A rusted helmet might appear in the riverbank. For most people, it was folklore, a ghost story told to scare children. But for Onoda, it was duty. His war was not yet over. By 1972, 27 years after World War II had ended, Onoda and Kozuka were still hiding. They were no longer soldiers of an empire. They were men trapped in time. But fate was about to send someone who would finally change everything. By the early 1970s, the world had moved far beyond the age of war that Hiroo Onoda remembered. Japan had become a modern nation, skyscrapers, color televisions, bustling cities, and a new generation that only read about World War II in textbooks. Yet, somewhere in the thick green heart of the Philippine jungle, time stood still. For Hiroo Onoda, the calendar might as well have read 1945. His war had never ended. In October 1972, nearly 3 decades after Japan's surrender, a local farmer on Lubang Island noticed 2 figures lurking near the edge of his rice field. They were thin, ragged, and carried old Japanese rifles wrapped in oilcloth. When he shouted, the 2 disappeared into the forest like ghosts. Later that day, gunshots echoed through the trees. Authorities investigated, and to their shock, found traces of recent activity. Footprints, campfire remains, and a faded Japanese flag hidden beneath leaves. One of those mysterious soldiers, Kinshichi Kozuka, was killed shortly after during a skirmish with local police. When word reached Japan, the news made headlines worldwide. Japanese soldier found still fighting WW2, 1972. Newspapers called it unbelievable, tragic, and heroic. People couldn't comprehend how someone could stay hidden for 29 years, still loyal to orders that no longer mattered. But there was one more man still out there, Hiroo Onoda, alive, armed, and convinced that Kozuka's death was the work of American forces. When Kozuka was shot, Onoda didn't see it as the end of a comrade. He saw it as proof that the war was still raging. "They've taken Kozuka," he whispered to himself, "but they will never take me alive." Meanwhile, in Japan, the public was fascinated. Books, documentaries, and radio shows discussed the mysterious holdout soldier. Many called him a tragic relic of the past, a man so loyal that he had lost touch with reality. Others saw him as a symbol of devotion, of a warrior's unbreakable will. But no one could reach him. Search teams had failed for decades. Then, in 1974, a young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki stepped forward. Suzuki wasn't a soldier or an official, he was a dreamer. He had a wild idea: travel the world to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. His friends laughed, thinking it was impossible, but Suzuki wasn't joking. He was fascinated by Onoda's story and believed he could connect with him on a human level, not as an authority, but as a fellow Japanese soul lost in time. Armed with little more than a camera, a backpack, and a heart full of determination, Suzuki arrived on Lubang Island. The locals warned him, "The Japanese ghost is dangerous. He shoots anyone who comes near." But Suzuki pressed on. He spent days wandering the forest, calling out, "Onoda-san! Onoda-san! I am Japanese. The war is over." Days turned into weeks. The jungle was merciless, full of insects, rain, and silence. But one day, as the golden light of evening filtered through the trees, Suzuki saw movement in the shadows. A man in an old, tattered uniform with a rifle slung across his shoulder slowly stepped out from behind a tree. His face was hard, his eyes sharp, yet weary. "Who are you?" Onoda demanded, his voice steady but suspicious. "I am Norio Suzuki," the young man replied, bowing slightly. "I am Japanese, just like you. The war ended a long time ago." Onoda narrowed his eyes. "You're lying. You could be working for the Americans." "I'm not lying," Suzuki said gently. "Japan is at peace now. The emperor has been alive and well for years. Tokyo is full of people living freely. I came here to find you because the world misses you." The two men stood there for a long moment, one representing the old Japan that refused to surrender, and the other representing the new Japan that had long moved on. Slowly, something shifted in Onoda's expression. He saw sincerity in Suzuki's eyes, not mockery or deception. For the first time in decades, he felt curiosity. Over the next few days, Suzuki returned to visit him, bringing gifts, photographs from modern Japan, newspapers, and even snacks from home. They sat under the stars and talked for hours. Suzuki never mocked Onoda. He listened, respected him, and treated him not as a relic, but as a man who had done his duty with unmatched loyalty. Finally, Onoda told him, "If what you say is true, I will not surrender to you. I will only surrender if my commanding officer orders me to." Suzuki nodded. "Then I will bring him to you." It was a promise, one that would lead to one of the most extraordinary meetings in modern history. Suzuki returned to Japan and searched tirelessly for Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda's former commanding officer. By then, Taniguchi was long retired and living quietly as a bookseller. When Suzuki told him about Onoda, the old man was stunned. "He's still alive, after all this time?" Taniguchi agreed to travel to Lubang Island. The Japanese government arranged it carefully, aware of how delicate the mission was. Onoda had been in hiding for nearly 30 years, and even a misunderstanding could turn violent. Finally, in March 1974, on a humid afternoon, a small team entered the jungle. At the front was Major Taniguchi, now gray-haired but still dignified in his old military uniform. When Onoda appeared, rifle in hand, Taniguchi stepped forward and saluted him. "Lieutenant Onoda," he said firmly, "I am your commanding officer. The war is over. Japan has surrendered. These are your final orders. Lay down your weapon and return home." For a long moment, Onoda stood frozen. The sound of the jungle faded. He stared at the man who had once given him the command to never surrender, and now was ordering him to stop. His lips trembled. His eyes filled with tears. Slowly, he removed his rifle, polished to perfection, and laid it gently on the ground. "My mission is over," he whispered. After 29 years in the jungle, Hiroo Onoda finally surrendered. The world was stunned. Reporters flooded the island. When Onoda emerged from the forest in his faded uniform, sword at his side, the crowd fell silent. He bowed deeply before the Philippine president, who pardoned him for his past actions, understanding that he had only been following orders. When Onoda returned to Japan, he was met with both admiration and confusion. Many called him a hero, a man of honor and unbreakable duty. Others pitied him, a soldier trapped in a war that had ended before he even realized. But in his heart, Onoda knew the truth. He had lived according to his mission, no matter how impossible it became. And yet, his story didn't end there. After returning home, Hiroo Onoda found himself lost in the modern world, a world that no longer spoke his language of loyalty and sacrifice. He would soon embark on one final journey, not of war, but of peace. When Hiroo Onoda returned to Japan in 1974, he stepped off the plane not as a soldier, but as a ghost from another time. Flashbulbs exploded as reporters crowded around him, shouting questions in a language that felt strangely unfamiliar. His own mother tongue, yet softened by 3 decades of peace. Japan had transformed beyond recognition. Neon lights, bullet trains, and towering skyscrapers replaced the streets he once knew. The empire he had fought to defend no longer existed, and the Japan that greeted him wasn't the one he remembered swearing his life to. The first thing Onoda noticed was the noise. Tokyo buzzed with an energy that made him uneasy. Laughter, car horns, advertisements blaring from every corner. People wore bright clothes and spoke casually about things he couldn't understand. To them, the war was ancient history. To him, it had ended only yesterday. He wandered through the streets as if walking through a dream, surrounded by his own countrymen, yet feeling completely alien. He met his family, older now, fragile, their faces lined with time. His brother embraced him with tears, whispering, "You're home, Hiroo. It's over." But for Onoda, it didn't feel over. He was still waking from a nightmare that had lasted 29 years. The world had changed, but his mind was still in the jungle. He still woke up at night, hearing gunfire that wasn't there. He still looked over his shoulder, expecting an ambush from the shadows. The Japanese government awarded him back pay and military honors, recognizing his loyalty and endurance. But Hiroo wasn't comfortable with fame. He disliked interviews and avoided the cameras that followed him. "I only did my duty," he told reporters. "Nothing more, nothing less." When people called him a hero, he would shake his head. "I am not a hero, I simply obeyed orders." The psychological weight of those years in isolation began to show. Modern Japan, with its consumer culture and Western influence, felt hollow to him. The youth were polite, but lacked the discipline and sense of duty he valued. He once remarked, "Japan may have advanced, but its spirit has faded." He couldn't understand how people could be so free, so careless, when he had sacrificed 3 decades of his life for the same country. In an attempt to find peace, Onoda moved to Brazil, where he bought land and started a cattle ranch. There, surrounded by open fields instead of jungles, he began to rebuild himself. Nature had always been his companion, and the quiet rhythm of farming gave him a sense of control again. For the first time since 1944, he felt like he was living, not surviving. But even there, he couldn't escape his past. Locals treated him with curiosity and respect, calling him the soldier who never surrendered. He received thousands of letters from people around the world. some thanking him for his loyalty, others questioning his sanity. But one letter from a Japanese boy changed his perspective. The child wrote, "I want to be strong like you, Onoda-san, but my friends say it's foolish to believe in something so completely." That letter struck something deep within him. It reminded him that loyalty, courage, and honor, values that once defined entire generations, were slowly fading from the modern world. He began to wonder if perhaps his final mission wasn't over after all. In 1980, Onoda returned to Japan once more, but this time with a new purpose, not to fight but to teach. He founded the Onoda Nature School, a camp dedicated to training young people in survival skills, self-discipline, and mental strength. He believed that true survival wasn't about fighting enemies in war, but about conquering weakness in one's own heart. At the camp, Onoda would rise at dawn dressed in simple clothes and lead students through forests and rivers. He taught them how to read the land, make fire, find water, and endure hardship. But most importantly, he taught them how to live with purpose. He would say, "You must never give up. No matter what the world tells you, stay true to your mission." His students described him as strict but kind. He never spoke of the war in anger or regret, only as a lesson about duty and belief. To him, surrender wasn't just about laying down a weapon, it was about giving up on oneself. And that, he believed, was something no person should ever do. Years later, as he grew old, Hiroo Onoda began to reflect on his life with a quiet sense of acceptance. He had spent nearly 30 years fighting an invisible war, and the rest of his life trying to make sense of it. When asked if he regretted anything, he said, "I only regret that I didn't understand the world sooner, but if I had known, I wouldn't have learned what it means to be truly alive." Onoda lived until 2014, passing away at the age of 91 in Tokyo, the same city that had once felt so foreign to him. At his funeral, people from Japan, Brazil, and even the Philippines paid their respects. They didn't just honor a soldier, they honored a man who embodied the strength of conviction, the cost of loyalty, and the tragedy of misplaced faith. Even today, his story stands as one of the most haunting and inspiring tales of the 20th century. It reminds us that war doesn't always end when the fighting stops. Sometimes it lingers in the hearts of those who fought it. And in that lonely jungle on Lubang Island, where the vines have long reclaimed the land, the echo of a single man's footsteps still lingers, a whisper of the soldier who never surrendered.